We know that data in education is a complex thing. We're here to help entangle some of those knots and do that all in the service of students and families. So our particular professional development here, the professional learning, is under contract with AOE, and it's related to early warning systems. And as I think we've mentioned on a couple of calls before, but we'll just reiterate here in case you're joining us for the first time or watching this video independently, is that early warning systems are really kind of meant to sit in the ecosystem of things that you're already doing in Vermont. So under Act 173, every district is supposed to have educational support teams, and those teams are really meant to ensure that students have the supports they need, that those students are getting equitable access to supports, that there's effective and measurable student plans, and then data is used in systematic planning. And so we know most districts, most schools in Vermont are familiar with MTSS, multi-tiered system of supports. Early warning system kind of slots into that framework. It's, MTSS can be used for any student. Early warning system is helping you to identify students that might need that intervention ahead of a crisis point. So that's really the motivation. And really the aim of these professional learning series is to help you think about, okay, how are we going to do that? What systems are we going to leverage? What data are we going to leverage? How do we put that all together? And so we've had some interesting conversations already with you all about the different types of indicators, how attendance data, behaviors, course completion can be early warning indicators, and some of the data that we might think is a little bit more exploratory in terms of mental health, social emotional learning, how that data might inform early warning systems. And then we'll go to the next slide. So I'm Sean Gill. I serve as the business solution owner here. That means for the most part, you won't hear a ton from me. I'll turn it over to our subject matter experts in a second. I lead our K-12 education consulting practice at Resultant. I have a background in state government and education policy research, and have really enjoyed the conversations that we've had with you thus far. And I'll allow Taisha to introduce herself.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Taisha Adams. I'm serving as a subject matter expert for this project, specifically owning the space of early warning and indicators and all things early warning, interventions, all that good stuff. Nishan mentioned, have a background in education, classroom teacher, school leadership, district leadership, state leadership. So I know the language, and I know the talk and have walked the walk. So I'm glad to be here with you.
Thanks, Taisha. Hey, everybody. My name is Latika Keegan. I'm serving as the technical advisor on this project. I'm a solutions architect for education at Resultant, and my background is mostly in K-12 public and charter education, serving in school leadership, district leadership, data systems implementation, and supporting end users. Glad to be here. Danny, for you.
Yep. Hey, everybody. I'm Danny Cuevas. I'm the project manager here, helping schedule these workshops and helping with the surveys that you might have seen come out from AOE and Resultant. I'm not a previous educator, but have worked on a ton of education projects during my time at Resultant.
We're working hard to make Danny an education expert. He's on his way.
I'm definitely picking up things. I will say that for sure. And it's actually my second EWS project, and one I'm becoming increasingly passionate about, I would say. Yeah.
And then I think on the next slide, we just asked folks from school districts to introduce themselves. I see that Ryan's put his name in the chat. Ryan, do you want to introduce yourself or say anything, and then we'll ask district folks to say hello.
Sure. This is Ryan Parkman at the AOE. I'm the program manager for the personalized learning team. And the early warning system is a project that I've been kind of tooling with for years, and it's great to finally see it getting out there. And I was just thinking that it's a real, having an early warning system in your school is a perfect way to systematize that idea of getting to know all your students and to provide the supports that the student needs, because we don't want to miss a student who may be exhibiting signs that they are in need of support. And like you said, we want to do that before a crisis happens. So this is I think it just really helps towards equitable opportunities for all students. You know, we can't just go by our gut feeling about a student and looking at what the grades in the class say. We really need that system that's going to bring in all those different indicators and provide it for us in that dashboard so it can help us identify who is in need. So I don't know, like Danny, I'm getting passionate about this. So if I talk too much, just kick me under the table. Thank you so much.
And totally, folks can use the chat. They can raise their hand. We'll take questions as we go. I see in the chat we have Christina from Rivendell Interstate School District. I'm assuming that means it's a Vermont, New Hampshire district, but maybe I'm wrong on that. I got it right. Awesome, that's cool. And then we have Danielle. I know Danielle's been with us before, and we'll be walking through some of our exercise with Danielle. It's great to have you from Franklin West. And then we have MJ. And she is representing the MTSS team from AOE. Awesome. Great to have your expertise here. I will walk through the agenda quickly, and then we'll get on our way with our content. So as noted, we have the Interoperability Capabilities Framework. What a mouthful. You'll hear that called the ICF. So Latika is going to give us, and Taisha are going to give us an overview of that. And then we're going to walk through a couple of the components of the ICF. Broadly, you know, what the purpose of this particular workshop is to do is to help you think about we talk a lot at Resultant about, you know, IT projects, data projects. It's people, process, and technology. There's three things that you have to think about. And in the context of education, that's a lot of different people, right? That's teachers, that's educators, that's your data coordinators. So this ICF is designed to help you think about how do we leverage what we have now, our assets that we have? How do we plan? How do we think about really supporting the things that need to happen from almost like a project management perspective to get an early warning system implemented in our district? Before we jump right in, any questions or concerns, comments about our agenda today? All right. I'm going to do the 8-second pause. All right. I think I'm turning it over to Latika.
Thanks, Sean. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here on this Friday. As Sean said, we're happy to have you. So we're going to spend the next segment of our presentation talking about implementation frameworks. And I'm switching terms on us here. While we have a framework to work with you on today, the Interoperability Capabilities Framework, we look at it more as an implementation capabilities framework because we aren't focusing on the interoperable portion today. We're focusing on implementation around early warning systems. The interoperable portion is specific to the EdFi data standard, interoperability being the seamless exchange of data between systems. So we're going to focus on the ICF with our minds thinking about EWS implementation. So what are these things? What is an ICF? It's a mouthful, but it's a tool that we use to plan for large-scale district-wide system implementations. And these are tools that are put together, developed by the EdFi Alliance community, and there are 3 different ones that are intended for 3 different audiences. There's one for state education agencies, there's one for local education agencies, for us SUSDs, and collaboratives, and then there's a different one for educator prep programs. So for today, we're going to focus on the middle one on this list, which is the local education agencies and collaboratives, which is most relevant to our groups here today. And really the purpose of these frameworks is to help districts, SUSDs, in assessing how ready they are with the resources, the skills, the processes, and the tools that are necessary for large-scale system implementations. And those could be technology and data systems. Any large district-wide initiative would fall under this scope. For example, early warning systems. So some of the terminology that you'll see in this framework, which we'll dive into very shortly, is going to be specific to EdFi. I want us to think about when you see EdFi, replace it with EWS. If that component that you're looking at still makes sense, we go ahead and approach it. Otherwise, We've set it aside and we move on. So just think about anywhere you see EdFi, that's EWS for our purposes of our workshop today, for our presentation. Okay, so that is the gist of what we're going to get into in a lot more detail. Ultimately, we're trying to answer the question, do you have the resources, skills, processes, and tools necessary to complete an implementation of an EWS? So we can move ahead to the next slide. And well, what does that mean? How do we prepare? How do we assess? And how do we prioritize? So there's a lot that goes into preparing, as you well know, because you are working in school districts, you've seen, you've heard, and you've been part of many different system implementations in one way or another. To accomplish an EWS implementation and make the best possible use of it over time, you have to have all of these things that go into making that project successful. And for the purposes of the ICF, those resources, skills, processes, and tools are collectively called capabilities. And we'll see that as we get into the actual framework itself. And you may have actually seen this before. If you were at our prior workshops, you would have gotten a little glimpse of what we're going to go into, knee deep or neck deep, depending on your perspective on the content. So you'll see in just a few minutes. So what we really want to think about is how are we assessing our alignment as an SU or ST to the necessary capabilities. And that word in that sentence, necessary, is really, really important because we ourselves are going to determine what is necessary for our respective districts. And that's going to be a recurring theme. It's not a prescription. It's a whole set of possible recommendations, and you will have to pick and choose what's necessary for you, for your school district, for your SU. So before starting, you need to know where you are in relation to those needed capabilities. And we look at all of those capabilities within 3 focus areas. So there's a ton of information, and we're going to start to look at how it's chunked together. So the first level of chunking is there are 3 focus areas that we need to assess within, and those are organizational and leadership management, technology systems, and then data usage from the lens of teaching and learning, or SUSDs. After assessing all of those capabilities within each of those 3 focus areas, there are many of them, like I said, we're going to identify what are high priority and high feasibility actions that we can take for our respective SUSD. And the next thing we're going to do is then use those prioritized items as a starting point for our roadmap. So we get started. Now, if you're thinking, well, I'm already in the middle of my EWS implementation, that's fine, because there are different phases for what we're going to look at. And we'll see that in a minute. So once you have your roadmap, create a timeline, and we are hoping that you can then engage a cross-functional team to lead and engage, to lead this work moving forward. Next slide. So a little background on the Implementation Capabilities Framework that we're going to look at. It has, like I said, many recommendations, and these are coming from focus groups, from interviews with people who have been through implementations, and it's just a huge collection of things to consider and pick and choose from. But ultimately, there are some points of emphasis. For example, a timely and coordinated implementation plan is necessary. Clear leadership and ownership, that's a very crucial aspect of a large system implementation. Cross-functional teams are a key component. It's great to get buy-in right up front from your key stakeholders so that you know that the project can move seamlessly towards success. And then, of course, technical experts and external support as needed. Okay, next slide. So what's in here? Let's take a look. 3 focus areas, mention that to you. Across those 3 focus areas, and you'll see a little more detail as we go through our slide deck here, there are 7 capabilities which map to 7 corresponding processes for each of those focus areas. So organizational leadership and management has 7, technology systems has another 7, and teaching and learning has another 7, total 21. Each of those capabilities and processes are then looked at from the lens of 4 different phases. And those phases map to where you are in the process of implementing an EWS. And those are as follows: preparing, implementing, improving, or maximizing. Are you preparing for an EWS implementation? Are you already in the middle of an implementation? Have you completed implementation and you are working on improving that? Or you're done improving some and you're actually trying to optimize, maximize, really push the envelope on your EWS data system. So those are 4 phases. We'll dig into that a little bit more. And now comes the big part. There are 240 possible actions you could choose from. So that's where your cross-functional team is so critical, because this is going to be a lot for 1 or 2 people to do. So you really have to socialize the approach to this tool to think about it across through a cross-functional team's work. So move forward to the next slide. This is what a little piece of it looks like. The structure of the ICF. As I explained it, this visual might help in understanding. So I want us to focus on just the left-hand side. If you look at one capability mapping to one process that then breaks out into 4 phases, and each of those phases has a bunch of action steps. They are numbered sequentially, action 1 through action 10. There may not be 10 under each of these processes phases. There may be differing numbers. So while in this instance, in this example, the focus area 1, process 1, under prepare has 3 actions. In another situation, there might be 5 actions. So you'll see a little variation depending on what the topic under discussion is, okay? And then if you look on the right-hand side, it expands out, right? We haven't put a ton of detail there just so that we wouldn't get overloaded with the information. But the ... dots indicate that there's more under these. And this is just one focus area. Now times this by 3. So it becomes very important to break this information down in chunks so that you can approach it and process it methodically and systematically. Okay, I'm going to pause for a moment. Are there any questions before we dig a little deeper? Okay. We haven't frightened you away yet, so we're good. We're going to keep going. Next slide. So speaking of the 7 capabilities and processes, these are the capability areas that we are going to look at. Under organizational leadership and management, which we are going to refer to as OM, you'll see that occurring as we go through our content here. There are 7 pieces: strategic oversight and performance management, data governance, change management, process management, project management, talent, and vendor management. So those are our 7 capabilities, 7 things that we need to think about under the umbrella of organizational leadership and management, and lots of little components under each of those areas, right? So next portion is technology systems, which we're going to refer to as TS. You'll see that in our slide deck, in our other materials. And that consists of customer relationship management, architecture development and management, risk management, information management, services and solutions development, and then deployment and management of those services and solutions, and then finally user support. So this is all around your IT. This is generally handled by your technical staff. It could be someone who has multiple hats if you are a medium-sized or smaller-sized district. Finally, on the right-hand side, we have the data usage section that refers to teaching and learning. So there's a section on vision and theory of action, data standards adoption, which will be, depending on where you are, may or may not be more or less relevant. We'll get there. Academic data identification, data quality and verification, data management, user accessibility and expertise, and then finally user input and system improvement. That's a lot. So everyone take a deep breath and step back for a moment. So we'll look at this a little bit at a time and show you how to actually work with this information. So next slide. When you are using the ICF, once again, and you're going to hear us say this a few more times, think about the unique circumstances of your district when you are setting your future targets. You're not going to be, all the way to the right when you look at your prepare, implement, improve, and maximize phases. You may be somewhere in between. There's no perfect answer. What's perfect is what you pick for your district. That's what's perfect. It has to be the right fit, reach that level that makes sense for your district. You can mark something as not as relevant and not feasible, meaning yes, it applies to your district, but at the moment, given the resources you have, it's not feasible. Okay. So there are going to be multiple layers in your self-assessment of your district's capabilities at this given moment. And they may change. They will change over time as things change. The third bullet point is super important. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So prioritize the capabilities that are quick wins and worthy investments for your district. And you're going to do that with discussion and deliberation with your cross-functional team. And then, like I mentioned before, wherever EdFi is in the ICF, consider replacing it with EWS for context and assess that recommendation accordingly. Okay, next slide. Yeah, there's a little bit of pre-work. So we're not quite diving in there yet. So think about where you are in your journey around EWS. You have to define your EWS related goals so that we are doing work in manageable chunks. Once you have that, or alongside having that, you're going to gather your cross-functional team and decide which of those team members who will review which focus area. So typically we see members from the leadership team, we see members from the IT team, and then we see instructionally focused interventionists, teachers, counselors, that sort of thing. Decide which team members will review each focus area. And then once we're done with this, we invite you to share the workshop recording, the slide deck with your team as supporting materials. And then, very important, schedule time for the initial review. And this may take multiple sessions. When you look at the amount of information that's available for you to assess, discuss, may take a few meetings, depending on the size of your team and depending on how deep you'd like to go into the framework. And then finally, plan when that team will reconvene after that initial review. So pre-work before we even jump in. So we'll go to the next slide. And then as you're using the ICF to assess, remember you can't do it all as one person. You're going to work in sub-teams. The first thing to do is to identify, as you're working through each of those components, each of the focus areas, each of the processes, each of the capabilities, you're going to identify which phase applies to your SUSD's EWS plans or implementation if you are already in there. It's prepare, implement, improve, maximize, and we'll look at that in just a moment. You're going to complete your assessment using that workbook. We're going to provide you with this spreadsheet tool that will help with planning. Think about priorities based on your goals. Consider feasibility based on your strengths and challenges, resources available, and resources that are not currently available to you. And then when you reconvene, be prepared to share, to present your work, and then think about how you might want to discuss and finalize each assessment of each of those focus areas. And then finally, you're going to consolidate all of that into one single spreadsheet. If you had sub-teams working on separate components, which typically is a good idea, and then put that all into the one spreadsheet so you can actually prioritize the work for the team. So next slide. Okay, so what does this actually look like? And I'm going to switch our screen share so that we can take a look at the actual spreadsheet. And I'm going to walk you through this. And then we're going to switch back to the PowerPoint slide deck so that we can continue working through the content in a more presentation-friendly format. So we are looking at an Excel workbook that has been set up with all of the components in the ICF for LEAs, and we're going to go through a few of those just to get a sense of how this spreadsheet actually even works. Okay, so the first tab, we have 3 tabs in the spreadsheet along the bottom. There's instructions, there's LEA ICF, and then there's a tab called Action Priority. The instructions tab, the sheet is what you're looking at. There's a welcome message. There are instructions that talks about how you're going to approach the spreadsheet with your team. As a team, for each focus area, review the capabilities, processes, and related actions. For each action, you're going to do the columns that are titled relevant and feasible. We'll get to those definitions in just a moment. They're down here below. You're going to assign a priority and indicate a current status to each of those actions, and then pick someone who's going to lead that action, and then put in an estimated completion date. And this is dynamic information. It could change over time. It probably will. You're estimating, right? Things happen, the priorities shift, the resources shift, and you have to adjust accordingly. And then finally, you're going to use the action priority sheet that will automatically update as you enter information in there to sequence the action steps for your team. So in the next sheet, you're going to see a whole bunch of columns, and these are the definitions for those columns. I'm going to move us to that next sheet, and I will explain some of those columns, and then we'll come back to the rest as we switch back to the slides. Okay, that's a lot of information, but I want you to focus on the right-hand side. We'll talk about focus area, capability, phase, process, action in just a moment. I want you to focus on the right-hand side. So when we look at columns G through M, there's a relevant, feasible, priority, status, action leader, estimated completion date. So some of these are really obvious. I'll work from right to left. Estimated completion date is your best estimate of when you might complete this action, which is in this row here. Action leader is your owner of that action, person who's going to be responsible for making sure that that work is moving forward. The status is going to be one of these three: complete, in progress, not started, not applicable. So you're really trying to get up to where it's marked as complete. It may not be applicable. You may not have started it. You may be in progress, and eventually you will be complete with that action. Priority goes to high, medium, low. That's fairly self-explanatory. Feasible. As I mentioned before, is this action that's being discussed on this row feasible for your school district or not? And you mark it accordingly. Yes, no, unsure. Okay. And you're aiming for everything that you have marked as relevant, feasible, high priority to be complete. That's the goal here. And then under relevant, it's very similar to feasible. Is this action relevant to your SUSD? Yes, no, or unsure. Once all this is filled out, you'll see that everything comes together on this action priority dashboard of sorts. And I'm going to make it a bit larger so you can see it better. What this does is summarize the top three, or I should say the closest three in time that you have marked as relevant, feasible, high priority action steps on that LEA ICF sheet that we were just looking at. So once you do that, this is going to start to populate the top three. And that helps your team focus in on this is what we're currently working on. As you change things to not relevant, not feasible, and less than high priority, those do not, they disappear off this list. And also, once you mark something complete, it disappears off this list. It will still remain in this other sheet where you always have a record of everything. But in this action priority, just so you can focus on what you're currently working on, we're just going to show those top three. So I'm going to pause for a moment. Are there any questions? And give you just a second to process that information. I know it was a lot. And then Danny will switch us back to our PowerPoint slide deck. No questions at the moment? Okay. Danny, if you could switch us to the slides. Okay. So, in summary, the LEA ICF, the Implementation Capabilities Framework workbook, that tool that you just saw is for planning. It's in a spreadsheet form, very easy to use for your cross-functional team to work through that ICF. includes 240 actions across the 3 focus areas. So a lot to dive into, a lot to look at, evaluate, and mark up. Enables discussion and assessment of your current state for your EWS and desired future state, and helps you prioritize and mark things as feasible to create that roadmap with action steps. So I'll give it another few seconds if anyone has thought of any questions.
I see we might have one question coming in, but
Yeah.
Latika, one thing I was just thinking about is to point out again that like that sort of first page of that spreadsheet is going to give you almost like your action items. So it's a nice way to, it feels like you'll be walking through a lot, but then it's going to kind of organize the thinking for you, almost like a project dashboard.
Yeah, and what you saw was really a pre-filled, like it's a finished version of that spreadsheet. When you look at the feasibility, the priority, and all of those columns on the right, when you start with a spreadsheet such as this, it's going to be blank. Yes, Danielle. Danielle's question is that a template that can be shared or does it need to be created? I like the connection between the sheets in terms of creating the action plan based on how the columns are filled in. Danielle, absolutely. We plan to make this spreadsheet available to everyone, and you're welcome to use it and adjust and modify it as you see fit. So the next slide talks about our approach today. We're going to deep dive into each focus area, so it's going to be a little intense, and we ask for your patience. Thank you, Danielle. Awesome. I could see it helping with MTSS implementation as well. Yeah, and that's exactly such a great point. It applies to system implementation, so feel free to use it for, beyond EWS. Deep dive into the focus areas, OM, TS, and TL. We're going to introduce the focus area once again, just reiterate those 7 processes that you saw. Because it's a lot of information, we'd like to give us another opportunity to make sure we're familiar with the language. And then we'd love to run a simulated self-assessment with districts, with maybe a small, medium, large, with the participants who are on the call today. So I know that Danielle has kindly volunteered to start us off with the OM section that Sean will lead in just a moment. And we would love to have the other 2 participants who are here, Christina and Megan, join us. Megan, I don't know if you would be interested, but we'd love to have you as the next 2 sections. We need one person to kind of run through the simulated self-assessment. So heads up, be thinking about how you'd like to approach as we walk through this first segment with Sean and Danielle. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Sean.
So these terms are, of course, all in the workbook, Organizational Leadership and Management. If at a very high level, is just thinking about, do we have the resources and processes for planning and managing our EWS or our MTSS, our other system? Danielle, I was thinking it might be interesting to walk through 2 of these with you, and I was thinking it might be interesting to do number 3, which is change management, and 6, which is talent management, if that works for you, unless there was another one that you wanted to do.
No, sure, that's fine.
And before we kind of dive into our simulated exercise, it would maybe just be great to hear a little bit of like what stage you kind of are in and your district with an early warning system.
Sure. So we had, one of the reasons I was drawn to this was when we did have a change in superintendents. That new superintendent came in with a clear recognition that we needed an early warning system and that we needed to focus on writing across the grades and content areas. That superintendent ended up only being with us for a year and then moved on. But now that I'm in this district level role of data and assessment and implementation and support with MTSS and trying to create SU-wide systems for the sake of, equity and high quality instruction and everything across the board, I think we find ourselves in position that we can also create an early warning system. I think it's still a valid discernment of our system that we need it, but I don't know that it's high on the priority. But when I saw it being offered, I thought I would join in and see what pre-learning I could do ahead of our district, because we do have EduClimber and we are working on making more robust and unified our MTSS frameworks and visioning there. And so I feel like that would be an obvious layer to add into the whole process. So I'm kind of here maverickly, but in support of the greater system to see what we can do there. So, because I do think it does work out that there's a lot of things we put into place for other priority reasons, but they also satisfy putting us into position for an early warning system. So.
Awesome. Great context. So I think we can go to slide 28 if I have my numbers right, Danny.
Yeah, can you remind me of the numbers again that you said?
It's OM3.
3. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so I think
Change management.
Change management, yep. So Danielle, when I was thinking about your experience when your district's at it, it feels like you're maybe sort of in the implement stage. Does that feel right? Like you've started to think about EWS. You're not maybe there yet, sort of in saying like it's officially an EWS, but you're kind of in that implement stage. Does that feel fair to you?
Yeah, it does.
Makes sense. So that sort of first question is getting at communication with stakeholders, and would love to hear a little bit of your thoughts on how are you doing that? Is that something you're working on in terms of communicating across your supervisory union?
Around the EWS in general and specifically? Yeah. I wouldn't say there's anything direct across the whole system, but definitely with my immediate central office partners. And as I play into having this conversation now, I realize I'm probably going to struggle talking about MTSS versus EWS.
Let's throw it all in. Let's throw it all in. Yeah.
The distinction between the two. So it's not on anyone's universal radar for the EWS, but certainly it's on everyone's radar that we have to start having more effective conversations about students and their data, the variety of data, engagement, social, emotional, academic. So yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question, Sean.
No, this is discussion topics, then we'll look at the spreadsheet in a second.
Okay.
So the next sort of standard there question is getting at so end users in this case would be educators, teachers that are using the MTSS or the EWS platform. And I'm wondering if there's a way that you're thinking about how do we understand their goals, their objectives, and their initial understandings of MTSS or early warning system concepts.
That we've started to slowly uncover through leadership teams that either existed or exist now because of the implementation of MTSS. And it's not universal. It's not a universal mindset that we have uncovered. Everything spans from doing what's best for kids and having a portion of our system recognize that it doesn't matter the plan status of a kid, we're going to give them what they need, to a whole other portion of our system saying, well, we need to document all this because it's a CYA when parents call us. And it's very different, right? So we have quite the spread, but I think we're acknowledging where the spread is and recognizing the work we need to do to help align our building leadership, because what we really want the building leadership to see is that they are the fidelity leaders to this vision. So
yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's a common thing we see across our clients, but with schools particularly, is there's sort of a maturity. That's sometimes how it's described, or just as we get a more complex understanding, we can move a little bit from more reacting to new ideas to thinking about it a bit more systemically. So that totally tracks. The last question on this one is just district leadership. We know different people, districts are structured in different ways. How are you engaged with district leaders around MTSS or early
Yeah.
warning system?
That one I can really speak to, because we've had, I can't remember what the model is, but it's like vision, skills, resource, action plan. But when you do what's the experience when you're missing something, like you're missing the vision or you're missing the action plan? We went through a model of that, and I could totally see there were spots in there where I've seen, oh, that's because we really don't have a clear vision, or we really don't have a clear action plan, or these are the places where the skills aren't really there yet. And so it leads to this anxiety, frustration, or like a false start kind of thing. And so in this whole process so far, I've spent a lot of time like meta thinking, like how to be a leader among leaders. And right now in our central office framework, there's 4 of us who share it together, the MTSS leadership, but not with any clear distinction. And so it's like the people who are available to work on the next steps get together and do that in between meetings. But I think we're finding in the whole system, not just in the central office, the benefit to having roles and responsibilities delineated could be really helpful. Because although I'm one of the district leaders, like we've had challenging meetings with our building leaders in the fall, and it's like, I wanted to say something to help the conversation move further, but I didn't know that what I was going to offer was in total agreement with the other central office leaders. And so who's running the show sometimes is the wonder, because we're trying to do it collaboratively, and it's not something one person or one role can really do, but it does really need a leader somewhere to help guide that uniform voice.
That makes sense, a lot of sense. And I think we'll hold on to that thought when we have a chance to look at the spreadsheet, because that's what we might put as our next step, is like, we know this is engaged district leadership it's relevant, it's probably a priority. And then, but what does that mean in practice in our district? And the first step might be sort of doing that roles and responsibilities, or revisiting that roles and responsibilities. In the interest of time, we'll just look at talent management briefly, which I think is slide 31. It's OM6. We have all the slides in the deck so that you can have all of it, but we've violated some PowerPoint best practices here with our big slide deck. And I think we'll just take a look at one of these. Because I think we've talked a little bit about roles and responsibilities, but maybe looking at 6.4, it's sort of assessing your current staffing. And I think, this is an interesting question to think about in the district context, where we wear multiple hats and people are doing multiple things. But just wondering if you've had any conversations about, is this, as EWS matures, is this something that would continue to be, as part of your roles and responsibilities? Would you have assistant administrators move different? Would you sort of assign that to student pathways team if some districts have that? So would love any thoughts if you've had conversations about current staffing.
Yeah, that's usually one of the common roadblocks from one of the schools in our systems, that they don't have enough interventionists, or they don't have enough of whatever role. And we've kind of pushed back, saying maybe it's how you structured your resources, right? If this is what you have right now and we need to implement this MTSS framework for our students, then this is our starting point, and we can't use that as an excuse to not do MTSS. And so some schools have talked about actual like numbers of FTEs. What I've encountered in my work is we can quickly hit on places where we have PD gaps and need to build a regular vision to, like, if I'm having everyone enter in their high leverage assessment math ratings, which is not scored numerically, it's scored through an OGAP framework on if the student used an additive strategy or was approaching to an additive strategy or multiplicative strategy, and they're solving then that means they need to have the ongoing assessment program, OGAP learning, in order to do that. And so even it's interesting because it's a pretty universal assessment. We all do it pre-K to 8. And yet I don't know that even though we've done checkmark, we do this, I don't think we know how to universally look at it with the right level of expertise so that we can respond to it. So that's just one example of like OGAP is not required training, and yet we're building something that's going to require that that's a element of ability and knowledge in our teachers. So how are we going to build a vision of SU-wide professional development for that? So I think it's, and that you can apply that logic to lots of other things too. Like there are many teachers through just their own training and through just the culture of education, operate in a way, whether they're consciously recognizing the belief that hinges on, but they operate in a way that I taught it, now someone else fixes it. If the student didn't get it, versus recognizing that they too are an interventionist in their own classroom. So there's a level of expertise I'm guessing is needed there, because either they don't recognize they have the skills or they truly don't have the skills to also be the interventionist in their classroom. So
that makes sense. And I think as we've started to talk, we're starting to think of a number of decision points that you've had to make, but many district supervisor unions might have to make, is thinking about, if we have the staff that we have, the team that we have, then some of our approach is thinking about how to provide the training and support, or taking stuff off of their plate, and that if we're providing PD around MTSS or early warning system, we can't sort of add that. We have to use the training days that we have, right? The in-service days that we have, or if we are in a position, and sometimes we are with title funds or whatnot, to think about how do we really leverage some of those specialist roles. Maybe that's the place that we put some of our effort and focus, and all of those decision points will kind of play out differently in districts and might evolve even over the course of the implementation. I'm seeing that we might have a thought from MJ. One thing I'll say too is that, again, all of these, we're walking through this conversation kind of model. This is the idea that we think would be great to have with a team at your district. So we're modeling it today, but knowing that, again, as we're pointing out, that we wouldn't expect, folks watching this or folks participating today, that this is something you do yourself, right? You can, but this is something you'd want to do with your team. Oh, it looks like MJ has to hop off. Well, thank you, MJ, for joining us. I think we've gotten to the place where we're going to take a stretch break. Is that right?
Did we want to look at the results first?
I think we are going to do that after we've
got it.
Yeah, we can do that when we come back from the stretch break. So Danny, if you would just give us a time, and then we'll return accordingly.
Yeah, let's do 3:08. I'll put in the chat.
Back in about 3 minutes or so. Look forward to it. Hello, we're back, I think, and I think what we're going to do is just have Taisha and Latika walk through a couple more of the other I'm calling them standards. I keep thinking they're standards.
Focus areas. You got it.
And then what we'll do is we'll fill in the we'll just walk through a couple of the items on the spreadsheet in the time that we have remaining. So I think it's going to go to Latika next.
Yeah. So let's skip ahead, Danny. We'll come back to the spreadsheet at the end of Taisha's section. So if you want to move forward, and Danielle, let us know when you're back.
I'm here.
Super. Okay. So because we're a small group, smaller now, we're just going to make it a little more efficient for this, for the purposes of our recording. and move quickly into technology systems. So I had highlighted here in the bold blue text the TS 1.0, 3.0, and 7.0. But let's go through one of them and then we'll see how our timing goes. So Danny, if you could move us to the first. And now we're thinking through the lens of an IT team member or IT leader, and thinking about this process, which is around creating and administering positive relationships with your IT customers. So if we once again look at the implement column, which we are in the midst of our implementation, and we have two things to think about as a starting point. So for discussion, Danielle, thinking about establishing strategic partnerships with program areas while building your reporting architecture, and in this case, we're talking about the EWS system to guide the work and help achieve their goals. So are there stakeholders who are using this information that are constantly and consistently involved in the conversation? How does your SUSD approach this?
Yeah, I feel like my job is to get into other people's lanes for a period of time and then come back into my lane. That's how I have realized the work has been, and how I would describe it. So I do partner with IT with making sure the infrastructure works and things, but there are certain systems I manage directly. I think there's a pedagogical element that doesn't automatically exist in an IT department within an educational system. So they are not the leaders in the system of what would become the EWS. That would be something that falls under my role, but they are definitely regular consultants. And then the end user is a big one too, to make sure that the data that's collected is the most relevant, and that it's accurate and timely, and understandable. So it really helps to illuminate the next step in a clear way for the end user, the teacher, and the leadership. And so I'm coordinating with people, like making sure devices work and things. But for the direct system that is EduClimber, for example, I manage the permissions and account access. So I've set up systems with our business office that when someone onboards or offboards, they let me know so that I can update systems access in EduClimber as well as STAR. But registrars do PowerSchool, for example. So those are the things I think of with that question.
Okay, thank you. And then when you think about the customer voice, let's call it, right, the intended end user, how do you collect feedback from those folks who are there use cases that you periodically, ask about? Are there visualizations that you provide in your EWS system or otherwise, which then are sort of like a prompt for conversation? How does that feedback come back to you?
Yeah, I usually, it's very difficult in this landscape to pull many people out of the building at the same time. And so what I've had to do in my process is I just go to a building where there's partners that can help with the build. So it help inform me on how to build it. And then once I get that to start, then I'll go to another school and find the partners there and maybe get their data that I can then put into the system that we're building and get their feedback in, and then pull together everyone to say, this is what we've created collaboratively as a group invested in this part of our system. This is how it's representing the data. Where's your refinement and feedback to make sure that this is hitting the need for what we need it to do. And so in that way, it's kind of like a grassroots approach to creating an SU-wide system with really trying to minimize the disruption to, who's in classrooms in the school day. So I'm really hitting mostly actually with the support staff and less the classroom teacher. But there are places in this next round where we're piloting the data entry of the high leverage assessments into EduClimber, where my partners will be the classroom teachers, and get their insight on what the walkthrough was of entering the data, make sure that also is fluid and efficient so that they're willing to do it, and that what the data looks like and how it's presented at the end, get their feedback as well, to make sure that so the bigger context of all this is have always been a data-rich, information-poor system. And so the idea that I am trying to utilize regularly is how can the data be presented in a way that it pretty much guarantees the information is falling right out of it, so that then we can jump to being actionable and get out of this admiring phase that we've grown accustomed to.
Yeah, and you have touched upon so many interesting nuances of what you're trying to do here. So when we go back to the spreadsheet tool and we look at it, you know, are these feasible for your SUSD? Well, probably. Are they relevant? Yes, it would seem so. And are they high priority? That's a discussion. Are they higher than other points? Maybe, maybe not. Right? So those are the kinds of things to consider, and you bring so much, you know, sort of wealth of information to the conversation. And that's the kind of thing you really want to sort of open up as a discussion with your cross-functional team. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Danny, you could move us along to the next, if you skip ahead to 3.0, TS3, we can touch upon IT risk. So if we look at the implement column, there's a couple of things on here that are actually somewhat tied to the data catalog workshop that we did. So 3.7, engaging program areas together with IT to define data access rights. Using a data dictionary to capture security level of the data and who can access the data. And then I'm going to sort of throw in 3.8 together in the interest of time, designing security access for all the dashboards and reports. So we're talking different levels of data, whether they're, you know, record level or they're aggregations. How is security and roles handled? Is that a high priority? Is that something that your SUSD can consider? How are you approaching that?
Yeah. You know, it's funny is I just kind of do things in a well-informed, transparent way and see how the system responds. So I didn't really have a collaborator in terms of like, how should we determine permissions? It was more like I built something with a clear, transparent rationale behind it to see then how does the system respond. And so my lived experience in this same district was when I was an interventionist, I only had access to certain information because someone in some other area had made some uninformed or, you know, unknowing determination that I didn't need that information, but I did. And it was really frustrating to work in a system where the data and information were withheld. And so I purposely built this in a way that we instead of trying to figure out who needs what information, we're going to instead capitalize on the ethics of the profession. And you're going to look at the kids that you need to look at. You're not going to look at the kids that aren't yours. And it allows for a system-wide view as well. So then you're not just seeing only the kids rostered to you, but you could look at a grade band of trends in your school because you're a cog in the wheel of that. So I did it as you can see the school for how that's set up, but I would imagine people don't have time to go and hunt around to kids that are not their business. And we do say that every time we have a meeting, let's hone in on the professional ethics and be mindful of how we talk about kids in this space and outside of this space, and know that you have access to more information than you probably need. There are some places like they don't know who's on free and reduced lunch. But some of us do. But it's funny because there's nearby districts where everyone knows who's on free and reduced lunch. For some reason, our SU really wants to protect that only so many people know it. But and then the other question, paras. So there's also been questions of equity in terms of like our paraprofessionals lower class citizens in an educational framework when we ask them to do so much and work so intently with maybe some of the highest need kids. And so they are always been an oversight or purposely left out of systems. So not knowing how we wanted to go forward, I gave them accounts in EduClimber. But it's not like they were necessarily told or asked to go in, but the access started there rather than starting them with being cut out. And the only feedback came 2 years later, so at the start of this year, where a principal was like, I'm good with them being in there, but I'm a little uncomfortable with them being able to know details about specific kids. So we put it as top secret, forced top secret for them. So the whole paraprofessionals group is forced top secret. So they could see whole school trends and grades, but they couldn't see which data is attached to which kid. And that was only one principal who gave that feedback, but I applied it to all. And now the system can kind of live into that and see if that fits a need or needs to be refined. But I work on a lot of things that aren't priority yet. So I'm just trying to set them up in a equitable, accessible way. And then the system can tell me if they like that or not, or how they might refine it.
Yeah, great points. And this is exactly the kind of thinking to do, is think through the layers of security and privacy that need to occur, but keeping in mind that really leverage your IT team to think about data security and privacy, confirm compliance with legislation and regulations, because that is super important. And you want to make sure that you are not, providing information outside of those bounds.
Mhm.
So with that, I will turn it over. We're going to skip ahead to our last segment, which is the data usage, teaching and learning. And thank you, Danielle, for hanging in there. We have a little bit longer to go here. I'm going to skip ahead to Taisha's section. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Latika. We are saving the best for last. All things data. Who doesn't want to talk about data, right? Okay. So we'll take a slightly different approach with this section, just in essence of time, because even after we finish with the third focus area, Danny's going to close us out with a little bit more information, and then of course evaluation. So we have 7 areas within this, components rather, within the focus area for teaching and learning. Of course, we're not going to go through all of those. We'll start with 4.0, talk a little bit about 5 and 6, and we'll wrap this presentation up. So Danny, you can go ahead and advance us, please. So this section, Danielle, all things data, we're going to go back to 4. I'm sorry, Danny. Go back 1. Here we go. Then in all things for data quality, well, teaching and learning rather, focus on data, access to data, who needs to own it, who needs to be taught how to use the data, how to collect it, all of those amazing things that and structures that are put in place to ensure that the data are reliable. I don't know if you were in the presentation where we talked about, we went a bit deeper in our conversation around indicators, just ensuring that when you're looking at your data points that the data is useful, it's valid, it's reliable, it's timely, it's all of that, in order to ensure that the data and indicators meet those criteria. That somebody has to be in place to make that happen. And as you know, our classroom teachers are generally not the ones that handle data in that capacity. So this is what T&L is really helping schools to think through: who needs to have their eyes on data. And this is what they do, solely focused on. So as we're looking at the implementation phase, we're thinking through, have we established policies and processes, data quality metrics to manage the creation, use, storage, accessibility of data? Have we utilized data collection processes that align to the data governance? Have we thought through how to avoid overwhelming data collection and validation, and then establishing deadlines that account for the technical capabilities of all data providers? A lot of text. So what I want to do is let's just talk. What can you tell us about your data collection process within your environment? What does that look like from the classroom to the person at the school or district that has it?
Yeah, if I started at the classroom level, that's the area where we don't have a good sense outside of the classroom about that data. And not that we certainly don't want to risk overwhelming our teachers, but to some level, if we're going to triangulate data, we need to identify key pieces of classroom data that then we could set aside next to our benchmarking, like our screening, our universal screener, and our state testing. So, and certainly if you are in the K through 4 grade band, we certainly have nothing. Uh-oh, family came home. Hold on, let me relocate. Yeah, lost track of time.
Oh, it is that time of the day, right?
Yeah. I thought I was watching the clock, but so in the K through 4 group, they don't even have a data system for reporting. And so it's not like they have Power School that they're entering scores into, and their report cards are not universal, and they're like Word documents. So we're really out of touch out of those classrooms. 5 through 12 uses Power School, and so we can get that information, gradebook information, and I guess transcripts and reports that are built in middle school and high school Power School. So, and then the rest of our systems, it's we have PBIS data in Swiss that comes into EduClimber. The attendance and demographics come in from Power School and rosters and gradebooks. We have the DESA for social emotional screener. And we have the STAR benchmark, the STAR 360. So we have that data come in, and I do the validation and things. So I had to do once we got EduClimber and started pulling together data and looking at the data, we started to realize that things weren't correct. And so I had to do, which often led me to clean up things like Swiss or clean up Power School. So it led to, we've done that work, but then you have to put in a regular maintenance of that work. So like I meet with our student support coordinator once a month to reconcile plan changes. Who went from an IEP to a 504 or 504 to an IEP, who's in a new referral process, right? To keep that plan status accurate as well. Checking in with EST coordinators to know who's being supported by EST. So it's a big cleanup followed by building a system to regularly maintain that those things are accurate.
Got it. Okay, so then from what I hear, it might be of value add to visit some of the activities, and forgive me, Latiga, if I'm messing up the term here, the 240 or the activities, tasks,
actions, all of those. You got it. Exactly.
All of those, the
to-do items.
The to-do items within the prepare column. I think it might be worthwhile to visit some of that. So and what I'm hearing a little bit of data quality and data management, which is the second slide that we're going to go to. And we can hop over there next.
Well, and I meant to also say that I'm in charge of building the local comprehensive assessment calendar and plan. And so one of the things that we've done over the last 2.5 years is tighten our windows. So I think that was one of the things of like the timeline of getting in the data. So we would have a STAR window and it would last a month and a half. And then your data is not comparable because the cuts change. The cuts change by day, right? So by tightening our windows to 2-week windows and to guarantee that timely flow of data to come in for, so that it's healthy, the data is healthy.
Okay. Danny, would you mind advancing, please? Do you mind? Okay, here we are. So this, I hear again a combination of what we see in 4 and 5 of what you've already spoken to. So not necessarily that we'll belabor the time today to do this, but components of what I'm hearing, I think it might be worthwhile to definitely revisit, even though we may find ourselves in the implementing stage, because I hear that we're further ahead in some areas, but still working through some nuances of others. So the preparation column, is one that I would draw your attention to as well, to take back with your team as you guys are determining the feasibility and walking through that the spreadsheet, which we are going to go to in a second. So this is, again, so we're now looking at the quality. We're looking at now how to manage that data. And part of that quality is also, like you said, getting the visibility into the school, but thinking about what is the transfer, the secure transfer from the school to the district, to the state. All of those important things are wrapped into or baked into letter TL4 and TL5. So even secure portals. Thinking about as you're working with your different vendors, what does that look like, and how to securely get the data to the hands of the people that need to get there, and who is the action leader, who is the owner of ensuring that the data being collected is serving the purpose of whatever we're trying to assess. And you mentioned MTSS. So we're looking at MTSS data. Who's that data person that's working with the data sets to ensure that it's matching even interventions? We could start talking about that as well, but I won't get too excited and get ahead of myself. But we can go to the next slide. Here, as we're talking about personnel, got to talk about, do they have the expertise and support? Yes, but do they have access to the appropriate data? And that is looking at across all stakeholders. So you're thinking about your parents. How are they going to access the data? Are we going, which data is important for us to embargo? Let's see, what is the timeline for those trainings? And you know that in education, it's so important to do backward design. What is the goal? What is the end goal? And then we're mapping our trainings and our activities from that particular end goal. So with that being said, I'm gonna pass it back over to Latika so that we can go ahead and jump into our spreadsheet.
Thanks, Taisha. So we're going to take a quick glance at the spreadsheet one more time. It is a lot of information, and by now you have an appreciation of the conversations, what they could look like, and how they could probably go on for a significant length of time. So you really want to be mindful of managing the approach to the spreadsheet. So the slides are there for reference. We can, we're happy to provide that in document format as well, if you prefer to just have something as a PDF and look at the information process by process on one page at a time. When you are dealing with the spreadsheet and you're trying to fill out and prioritize all these actions, you can approach it in two different ways at the very least. You can go row by row, look at the process, the action item, that this is the action step that it's being called out here, and then go across to mark it as relevant, feasible, assign it a priority, mark up the status, put in an action leader's name and an estimated completion date. And the other way you could do this is to go column by column, just for your section. So go through all of the actions and decide which ones are relevant and which ones are not. And then come back through in a second pass through this and decide, well, what's feasible and what is not. And then go back through and do priority. I think you get the idea. You're going to make it so that you're doing your similar thinking, assessment, evaluation, self-assessment at the same time. All relevant, all feasible, all priority, all status, and then think through action leaders. So depending on how your team prefers to work, you can do it that way. So we now have, at the end of our discussions, our meetings, we should have a very lengthy spreadsheet with everything filled out. Ideally, I'm just going to pop to the bottom here. And all 240 items should be marked with something or other in every single column, even if they are not relevant, not feasible, low priority, not applicable. That's okay. It's just what is specific and relevant and needed at your SUSD. There is no wrong answer. The right answer is your answer. And then once again, just to show the action priority sheet that prioritizes what's immediately on the horizon for your team to focus on. So with that, I will ask Danny if you wouldn't mind sharing that slide deck one more time, and we can close it out with your portion. You're on mute. Yep, there you go.
You can see it, the screen, the PowerPoint?
Yes,
Perfect.
we can.
All right. All right. Well, yeah, we are ready to close out this workshop. Thank you, Latika, Sean, and Taisha for walking through the workbook. I think that will be really helpful for everybody who's here and who's watching. So you belong to an SUSD. You've attended this workshop. You're watching this recording. We walked through the ICF. What's next? How do I put this ICF into practice? We have some next steps on screen for you all here. So a lot of this we've already seen, but let's just go ahead and review. There is some pre-work that you have to complete before getting your team together and looking at the ICF. You want to define your EWS goals and priorities, and then from there, start gathering your cross-functional team, which is made up of smaller sub-teams that focus on the different areas, so OM, TL, and TS. You want to schedule time to review the ICF, doing that initial review with those sub-teams. So that's going to consist of multiple meetings, maybe multiple meetings for each sub-team as well, to finish that self-assessment. And then from there, plan a time when the entire cross-functional team will reconvene for a initial review of that. You're going to meet with the sub-teams, look at the different focus areas, complete your assessment. So really doing what we did today, having that internal conversation and deliberation, and assessing where you are currently with these different capabilities. And then meet with that cross-functional team and share your work. You want to discuss, finalize, and consolidate that assessment as well. And one more thing I'll note, will probably be helpful to share this slide deck and recording with those teams before you have these conversations. So you've met with the sub-teams, you've met as a cross-functional group, and have a good base understanding of where you are in the current state. From there, you want to start prioritizing. So you saw it's the last sheet on that workbook where it's 3 dashboards that show the prioritized processes and actions you want to pursue first. Use that to guide where you go next. And then from there, after you've set those future state targets, you can start developing an action plan for each of those. A lot of this does relate to slides 14 and 15 earlier in the slide deck. So there's a note here at the bottom. Make sure to take a look there and review this as well as you plan out next steps for using and leveraging the ICF. Obviously, we did go through a lot of content today. Luckily, there is the EWS resource site at your disposal. It will have this recording, this slide deck, the ICF workbook, along with resources from previous workshops. So that includes the recordings, slide decks, handouts. You can also find the workshop calendar, links to RSVP to the future workshops, and then any news and updates regarding this professional learning series. Speaking of upcoming workshops, we have one more planned, and that's for Thursday, November 30th, the week after Thanksgiving. And that will focus on the different platforms and tools that can be available to you to help with your EWS, and then also tracking the impact of interventions. And that wraps up our workshop. We can open the floor to any questions.
Huge thank you to you, Danielle, for sticking with us to the very end. Of course, we're happy to take questions offline too, and we'll definitely follow up with some other opportunities post the workshop for some office hours and custom coaching as well.
Yeah. Last thing I'll note, if you are watching the recording, you should be able to see on the resource site some contact information for Ryan Parkman and also our team. So if you do have questions about what we've seen here today, you can reach out to those folks.